The day Wallace Malone rode into the settlement of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, he carried nothing but a saddlebag half full of regret and a name that used to mean something dangerous in 3 territories. He came slow, the way a man comes when he is not sure he deserves to arrive anywhere at all. His horse, a gray roan named Jasper, moved through the main street at a tired walk, hooves kicking up dry red dust that hung in the afternoon air like smoke from a fire that had long since burned out. Wallace kept his hat low, not from habit of hiding, but from a genuine desire to go unnoticed, to slip into whatever quiet corner this small patch of Kansas civilization might offer and simply stop being the man he had been. Caldwell Creek was not much to look at. A general store with a crooked sign, a livery stable that smelled powerfully of hay and old leather, a church painted white that had started peeling somewhere around 1874, judging by the curling strips of paint dangling from the eaves, a saloon called the Brass Lantern that was doing modest business even in the early afternoon, a handful of homes stretching back from the main road in neat, tired rows, their gardens trying hard against the unforgiving Kansas soil, and at the far end of the street, a smithy and a small boarding house that flew a modest hand-stitched curtain in a front window. Wallace had heard about Caldwell Creek from a traveling preacher he had crossed paths with outside of Wichita. The preacher had called it a quiet settlement, the kind of place where a man could live without too many questions being asked. That was all Wallace needed to hear. He had been running from questions for the better part of 4 years, and he was tired of running. He was 28 years old and he felt 60. He dismounted outside the livery stable, his boots meeting the ground with a dull thud. He led Jasper inside and arranged a boarding rate with a weathered man named Pete who had the look of someone who had decided long ago that horses were better company than people, and had not been proved wrong. Wallace paid 3 days in advance from a modest pouch of coins, which was almost everything he had left, and stepped back out into the light. He stood on the street for a moment, looking both directions, feeling the enormous weight of nothing pressing against him. This was it. This was the place. He was going to bury his past here, deep in the Kansas ground where nobody would dig for it. He had been a hired gun, not a common outlaw, not a bank robber or a cattle thief, but a man who had carried a reputation for speed and accuracy, and a willingness to work for the highest bidder without asking too many questions about who deserved what. That reputation had made him money. It had also made him complicit in things he could not scrub clean no matter how many rivers he bathed in or how many bottles of whiskey he worked through. The last job he had taken, for a land baron in Colorado Territory who wanted a family of homesteaders driven off their land, had been the final straw. He had not fired a single shot at that family. He had looked at the children standing in the doorway of their small sod house, and he had turned his horse around and ridden away from the baron's employ and never looked back. But riding away from that job had not cleaned him of the ones before it. Those were still there, settled in his chest like old stones, and he carried them with him now as he crossed the main street of Caldwell Creek and pushed open the door of the general store to ask about a room. The bell above the door announced his entry with a cheerful little ring that seemed entirely inappropriate for how he was feeling. The store was small and well organized, the shelves stocked with dry goods, bolts of calico fabric, tins of tobacco, coils of rope, and the general assortment of necessities that any small frontier community required. The smell inside was a pleasant combination of coffee, sawdust, and something baking somewhere in the back. There was a counter along the far wall, and behind the counter stood a woman who was in the process of writing something in a ledger with the focused intensity of a person who does not suffer interruptions gladly. She did not look up when he entered. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment, hat in hand, turning it slowly. She was perhaps 24 or 25 years old, he thought. She had dark brown hair pinned up in a practical style, with a few strands escaped around her face in the way that happened to people who worked hard through a long day. She wore a plain dark green dress with a white collar and an apron over the front that had a smudge of flour on one side, confirming the baking smell. Her face, when she finally lifted it to look at him, was striking in the way that honest faces sometimes are, not fashionably pretty in the style of the daguerreotype portraits he had seen in parlors, but genuinely, naturally beautiful in the way the Kansas prairie was beautiful on a clear morning, strong-boned and open and lit from somewhere inside. Her eyes were a warm brown, and they assessed him with a frankness that stopped him from offering his usual disarming smile. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was direct, not unfriendly, but not deferential either, the voice of a woman who had been running her own affairs for some time and was comfortable doing so. "I was told there might be a room available somewhere in town," Wallace said. He kept his voice even, his manner unhurried. "Somewhere other than the saloon." She studied him for a beat longer than was entirely polite. "My boarding house has one room open, end of the street. I charge $4 a month, meals included at breakfast and supper. No drinking in the rooms and no trouble." "No trouble," he agreed quietly. "That is exactly what I am here to avoid." Something passed across her expression, a flicker of something he could not quite name. Not suspicion exactly, more like measurement. "I am Anna Carter," she said. "The boarding house is mine. Come by after 5 this evening and I will show you the room before you decide." "Wallace Malone," he said. He watched her face for any recognition of the name and found none, which was a small mercy. "Mr. Malone," she said, and turned back to her ledger with a finality that made it clear the conversation was complete. He bought a small amount of tobacco and a tin of beans and a loaf of bread from the shelf beside the counter and paid for them and left. Out on the street, he stood in the afternoon sun and felt something he had not felt in a considerable while, something small but present, like the first tender shoot of a plant through winter ground. He could not have named it precisely. He only knew that whatever it was, it made him feel more awake than he had in months. He spent the afternoon at the Brass Lantern with a single glass of whiskey, listening to the talk of the other men at the bar. It was the kind of listening that had served him well in his former life, a quiet inventory of who was who, what mattered in this place, where the tensions lived. He heard about the cattle season coming up, about the drought that had dried up the creek at the edge of town the previous autumn, about a rancher named Horace Dunmore who owned a considerable stretch of land north of the settlement and who had a habit of pushing his fences slightly further onto neighboring properties each season. He heard about a circuit preacher who came through every third Sunday. He heard about the spring festival that was being organized for the end of April. He heard nothing about Anna Carter, which in a small town either meant she was entirely unremarkable or so deeply established that people did not think to mention her unless directly asked. He found himself suspecting it was the latter. At 5 o'clock, he walked to the boarding house at the end of the street. It was a modest 2-story structure, better maintained than most of what he had seen in Caldwell Creek, with a kitchen garden running along one side that showed the disciplined attention of someone who took their planting seriously. Even in early April, the beds were turned and ready, with the first green suggestions of something coming up in the protected rows closest to the south-facing wall. Anna Carter answered the door before he knocked, which told him she had been watching the street. She showed him the room without ceremony, a clean small space on the second floor with a window that faced east, a narrow bed with a good quilt, a washstand and a single wooden chair beside a small desk. It was spare, but it was clean in the bone-deep way of a place that was regularly, carefully tended. "The other boarder is Mr. Amos Fielding," she said. "He is the schoolteacher. He keeps quiet hours and expects the same." "I am a quiet man," Wallace said. She gave him that measuring look again. "You are welcome to take the room, Mr. Malone, but I want to be straightforward with you. I run a respectable house, and I keep my own counsel about what I see and hear within it. You will get no gossip from me about my other tenants, and I expect the same consideration in return." "That is fair," he said. "What brings you to Caldwell Creek?" she asked. It was not a suspicious question. It was the practical question of a woman who managed a boarding house and had a legitimate interest in the nature of the people living under her roof. He hesitated only a moment. "I am looking to put down some roots," he said. "I have been moving around for a good number of years. I would like to stop." She looked at him steadily. "Farming. If someone will have me, or labor, or whatever there is that needs doing, I am not particular about the work." She nodded once, as if she had made some interior decision. "I will take $4 at the beginning of each month," she said. "First month payable now." He paid her and she gave him a key and showed him the kitchen hours and the pump in the yard and the outhouse behind the garden, and that was the formal conclusion of the transaction. But as he turned to go up to his room, she said one more thing. "There is a rancher named Theodore Hale about 2 miles north along the post road. He lost 2 hands to a trail drive in February and has not replaced them yet. If you are serious about work, he is the place to start." He looked back at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." "Miss Carter," she said, without any particular weight on the correction, just setting the record straight. "Supper is at 6. He learned, over the following days, the particular shape of Anna Carter's life, the way you learn such things when you share a roof with someone, not through direct inquiry but through the accumulation of small observed details. She was 24 years old, he discovered from a casual comment by Amos Fielding, who was a small, kind-eyed man of 40 who seemed to regard Anna with a combination of fondness and gentle admiration. She had come to Caldwell Creek 3 years earlier with her father, John Carter, who had been a carpenter, and had built several of the better structures in the settlement, including the church and the boarding house itself. John Carter had died of a fever the previous winter, and Anna had continued running the boarding house alone rather than selling it and returning to whatever family she had further east. She was, in the estimation of every person Wallace spoke to in those first days, well regarded. The preacher mentioned her generosity when a family arrived destitute from a failed homestead further west. The woman at the general store, who Wallace learned was named Martha Cullen, and who was perhaps the most comprehensive source of settlement knowledge he had encountered, said Anna Carter was the most capable young woman she had ever known, and that it was a crime she was not already married, though not from lack of opportunity. When Wallace asked, with what he hoped was casual indifference, why she was not, Martha Cullen gave him a knowing look over the bolts of fabric she was stacking and said simply, "Anna Carter does not do anything by halves. She is waiting for something real." He took the job with Theodore Hale, who was a good-natured man of 50-something with a ranch of moderate size. A small herd of cattle he ran on open range, and the manner of someone who asked a reasonable wages work for a reasonable wage and did not particularly care about a man's history as long as he showed up sober and worked hard. Wallace showed up sober and worked hard. He had done physical labor before, in the periods between jobs when he needed to keep low, and he fell back into it with the relief of a man who finds honest work to be a form of penance he is capable of performing. He mended fences. He helped with the small spring cattle count, riding through the brush-patched pastures alongside Hale's other hand, a taciturn Texan named Cooper who communicated primarily in nods and had the efficient rope work of a man who had been doing it since childhood. He cleaned the stables and repaired the roof of the smaller barn that had suffered damage from a winter storm. He worked from sunup and was back at the boarding house in time for supper, which Anna Carter served with quiet efficiency at the long kitchen table. Supper was his favorite hour of the day. It surprised him that this was true. He had not thought of himself as someone who put value on domestic things. But there was something about that kitchen in the evening, the yellow lamp light, the smell of whatever Anna had cooked, the comfortable sounds of Amos Fielding talking amiably about his students, the simple act of sitting down at a table with people and eating food that someone had made with care. It felt like something he had been starving for without knowing it. Anna sat at the head of the table, and ate with the same quiet efficiency with which she did everything. She was not a woman given to long speeches or performative warmth, but she noticed things. She noticed when Wallace's left hand was bothering him from a strain he had picked up fixing a fence post, and she left a small pot of some kind of liniment on the hall table outside his door without comment. She noticed when Amos Fielding was having a difficult week with one of his students, and she made his favorite meal, a good beef and vegetable stew, without being asked. She noticed when the garden needed attention, and she gave it attention. She moved through her world with a steady, purposeful grace that Wallace found himself watching with an attention he tried to discipline and could not quite manage. He had been at the boarding house for 2 weeks when the first real conversation happened. Not the brief exchanges of daily life, not the practical arrangements of a shared household, but a genuine conversation that started as something else entirely. It was a Sunday evening, and Amos Fielding had gone to a neighbor's house for a card game. Wallace was sitting on the porch steps cleaning his revolver, which he kept more out of habit than any present need, when Anna came out through the front door with a cup of coffee in each hand and sat down on the top step a few feet from him. She handed him one of the cups without asking if he wanted it. He looked at the revolver in his hands. He almost put it away. Then he thought that would be more obvious than simply continuing, so he continued, though more slowly. She looked at the gun with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had grown up in the West and knew that most men carried firearms the way most men carried boots. There was nothing alarmed or disapproving in her expression. She sipped her coffee and looked out at the darkening street. "You are getting comfortable here," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am trying to," he said. "Mr. Hale says you are a good worker." He looked at her briefly. "You asked him about me?" "He volunteered it," she said. "He was in the store on Friday. He said you work like a man who has something to prove." Wallace set the revolver down on his knee and picked up his coffee. "Is that a complaint or a compliment from Hale?" "He said it with considerable approval," Anna said. The ghost of a smile moved across her mouth. "He is not a subtle man. I think if he had wanted to criticize you, you would know it." "True enough." He looked down the empty evening street. A dog moved along the far side, investigating something in the dust. The last light was red and low on the horizon. "Do you always evaluate your boarders through their employers?" "Only the ones who arrive with nothing and say very little about where they came from," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only an honesty that he had come to recognize as characteristic. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did things I am not proud of before I came here. I'm not going to dress it up in anything better than that." She turned to look at him directly. Her brown eyes in the last of the evening light were steady and serious. "Does anyone in Caldwell Creek have cause to come looking for you?" He thought about it carefully. "No, not anymore. The land baron in Colorado had not pursued him. The men whose behalf he had worked on before that had no claim to make against him, having paid him and received what they paid for. The families he had frightened off lands they had tried to homestead honestly, those he could not make right except by being a different man now." "Then what you were is your own business," Anna said. "What you are here is what matters to me." He looked at her and felt something shift in his chest, something structural, like a stone wall developing a crack through which light was beginning to move. "That is a generous philosophy," he said quietly. "It is a practical one," she said. "I cannot run a boarding house and spend my time investigating the histories of every man who passes through. And I have learned that a person's character is visible in their daily actions better than in any story they tell about themselves." She paused. "You are kind to Mr. Fielding. You fixed the hinge on the back gate without being asked and did not make a point of it. You eat what is put in front of you without complaint, and you say thank you every time. Those things tell me more than whatever you did before you got here." Wallace looked at her for a long moment. He was aware of a new kind of danger in this woman, not the kind that threatened his life or his freedom, but the kind that threatened the careful distance he had placed between himself and any future worth having. He had told himself he was here to be quiet, to work, to atone in the small daily ways available to him, not to want anything for himself. "You notice a great deal," he said. "Yes," she agreed simply. "I always have." They sat in companionable silence for a while after that, finishing their coffee as the stars came out over Kansas with their usual indifferent brilliance. And when the night chill sharpened enough to warrant going inside, they went in at the same time, and she paused at the foot of the stairs and said good night to him with the warmth of someone who had made up their mind about a person. And he said good night back, and he lay awake in the narrow bed for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of the prairie wind around the eaves. He began to understand, as April deepened and the warmth returned to the Kansas days, that Anna Carter had more weight on her shoulders than she showed. The boarding house was her livelihood, and it provided a modest one, but her father had left behind a small debt to the settlement's land office on a parcel he had purchased with the intention of expanding the house, and that debt had 2 years left on its term and required a quarterly payment that, from what Wallace could gather from the careful economy of the household, was not a comfortable burden to carry alone. He learned this not from Anna, who said nothing about it, but from Martha Cullen at the general store, who had a warm regard for Anna that expressed itself in the form of telling other people about Anna's difficulties in a tone of protective concern. Martha told Wallace, who was buying flour and did not ask, that it was a shame what the land office was charging, and that John Carter had been a fine man who had planned to build a proper inn and had not lived to do it, and that Anna Carter was stubborn enough to carry the whole thing herself rather than accept help from anyone, and that someone ought to do something about it. Wallace thought about that. He had been saving his wages from Hale's ranch with the vague intention of finding a parcel of his own eventually, something small, something that was genuinely his, built from honest work. He had about $60 set aside now. He thought about the debt. He thought about it and then he put it aside, because doing something about another person's debt without being asked was not a thing you did to someone like Anna Carter. She was not a problem to be solved. She was a person with a plan, and inserting himself into that plan uninvited would be a kind of insult dressed up as kindness. What he did instead was offer to help with the physical work of the boarding house on his days off from the Hale ranch. He presented it as being in his own interest, which was partly true. "The porch boards need replacing on the south side," he said one morning, "and I would rather have something to do with my hands on a Saturday than sit idle. I will buy the lumber myself if you will let me use your tools." She looked at him with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether to push back on something. Then she said, "I have lumber in the back from a delivery last fall. My father ordered it before he got sick. It has been sitting under canvas. You are welcome to use it." He spent that Saturday replacing the porch boards. He spent the following Saturday repairing the roof of the small storage shed behind the kitchen garden. The Saturday after that, Anna came out in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and a clear intention to help, and they worked together for most of the day, she directing and fetching and holding boards while he nailed, and the easy collaboration between them felt as natural as breathing in a way that Wallace noticed and did not comment on, because commenting on it would have been like pointing at a deer that hadn't yet heard you and was still standing peacefully in the clearing. The April festival arrived on the last Saturday of the month. It was a modest affair by any larger town standards, held in the open space between the church and the general store, with a fiddle player named Donovan and his son on the banjo providing music, and long tables set up with covered dishes brought by most of the settlement's families. There was dancing on a flattened patch of grass, and children running between adults' legs, and the general atmosphere of a community that had made it through a hard winter and wanted to celebrate that fact. Wallace went because not going would have seemed odd, and because Amos Fielding had asked him with such genuine hope that it would have been unkind to refuse. He stood at the edge of things, a cup of sweet tea in hand, watching the dancing with the detached appreciation of a man who had not danced in so long he was not confident it was still a skill he possessed. Anna arrived late because she had been the last to arrive, having organized most of the food tables. She wore a dress he had not seen before, a pale blue that was not festive in the elaborate sense but was the color of a clear morning sky, and she had her hair done differently, looser, with a small blue ribbon threaded through it that matched the dress. She moved through the crowd with her characteristic efficiency, straightening things, greeting people, laughing at something that the older woman beside her said. She caught his eye across the space between them and gave him a small, frank smile that was nothing more or less than the smile of a person who was glad to see a familiar face in a crowd. He felt it in his solar plexus like the first warm day after a long winter. Amos Fielding found him and drew him into a conversation with two other men about the upcoming cattle drive season, and Wallace listened and contributed moderately and kept one part of his attention tracking where Anna was at all times, which was something he recognized as a problem and could not stop doing. The dancing started properly after supper, and Donovan's fiddle carried above the evening noise with the insistent energy of someone who loved playing more than almost anything else. People moved onto the grass. The older couples danced with the comfortable familiarity of long habit. The younger ones danced with more energy and less grace and considerably more happiness. He was calculating how to exit gracefully when Anna appeared at his elbow. "Do you dance, Mr. Malone?" she asked. He looked at her. The light from the lantern strung between posts caught the blue of her dress and the dark of her hair and the directness of her gaze. "Not well," he said. "Neither do I," she said, "but I find the alternative, which is standing here looking useful, more tiresome than the dancing." He set down his cup. In that case, he was not, in fact, a terrible dancer. He was unpracticed, but he had a natural sense of rhythm, and he was steady on his feet, and he was careful not to lead too aggressively. Anna, for her part, danced with the same economy of motion she brought to everything, no wasted movement, clean and sure. And in the particular way of dancing together, where you are close enough to feel the warmth of another person, and the music is setting the terms for how much space there is between you, something happened that went beyond the polite fact of two people sharing a dance at a community festival. Her hand was in his and his hand was at her waist, and they were turning together to Donovan's fiddle, and she was looking at him with those steady, warm eyes. And he thought, with the sudden clarity of a man who has been trying not to think something for several weeks, that he was in very serious trouble. The song ended, and they separated with the natural propriety of the time and place, and she thanked him for the dance and went to help someone who was reorganizing a table, and he watched her go and understood that burying his past was one thing, and building something new was another, and that he had not planned for the second and was not sure he was entitled to it. He spent the following week in a state of internal argument that he managed to keep entirely invisible, which was a skill he had developed in his former life for entirely different reasons. He told himself the same things a man in his position tells himself: that she was a respectable woman with a life and a community, and no need of someone like him complicating it. That he had nothing to offer her, no land, no certainty, nothing built. That the gap between who he had been and who she was deserved more than 4 weeks of fence mending as a bridge. He mended another fence at Hale's ranch, and fixed a water trough and branded calves on the roundup day, and did every piece of work in front of him with the focused determination of a man who is working to stay ahead of his own thoughts. He was not entirely successful, because Anna Carter was not a woman who was easy to avoid when you lived in her house, and she had a quality that was particularly dangerous to a man trying to maintain distance, which was the quality of simply seeing him. Not the old version of him, the one built for intimidation and efficiency, but the one that was here now, turning awkwardly toward something better. She brought him a cup of coffee one morning before he left for the ranch, the way she sometimes did, and she said, "You have been very quiet this week." "I'm a quiet man," he said, using his own previous line back. She gave him a small, knowing look that told him she had noticed it was a deflection. "You are," she agreed. "But this week you have been particularly quiet in the way of someone who has something on their mind." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Are you always this observant?" "Generally, yes," she said. "It drives some people quite mad." "It does not drive me mad," he said, more honestly than he had intended. Something happened in her expression then, a small, careful opening, like a door that has been unlatched and swings just a fraction forward and then stops, waiting for a reason to open further. "Good," she said quietly. She took his empty cup and went back inside. He rode to the ranch thinking about the unlatched door. In the second week of May, the situation with Horace Dunmore, the rancher with the expanding fences, came to a proper head. Dunmore had moved his fence line on the north side of Theodore Hale's property by what amounted to 30 yards over the course of 2 seasons, and Hale had been tolerating it with the patience of a man who did not like conflict and was still calculating whether the principle was worth the trouble. When Dunmore's men took down a section of Hale's own fence to run new wire in a direction that would cut off access to the creek, Hale's patience ran out. Wallace was there when Hale confronted 2 of Dunmore's men at the fence line, and he stood beside Hale with the quiet, undemonstrative steadiness of someone who knows how these situations can go and intends to prevent the worst version of them. He said very little. He did not need to say very much. The 2 Dunmore hands were young and aggressive and full of Dunmore's confidence that he was too large and too connected to be challenged. But they read Wallace the way men in that line of work learn to read other men, and what they read gave them pause. The confrontation ended without violence, with Dunmore's men retreating and Hale writing a formal complaint to the county land office. Wallace filed a corroborating statement, and 3 weeks later, after some bureaucratic deliberation that everyone in the settlement followed with considerable interest, the land office ruled in Hale's favor and Dunmore was required to pull his wire back to the proper boundary. It was not a violent resolution. Wallace was glad of it. He was more glad of something else, which was the conversation that happened in Anna's kitchen the evening after the ruling came through, when Amos Fielding brought the news in from the general store where it had been the talk of the afternoon, and Anna looked across the table at Wallace and said, "I heard you stood with Mr. Hale." "He needed someone to stand with him," Wallace said. "Not everyone would have," she said. She was not flattering him. She was stating a fact with the precision she gave to all facts. "Dunmore has a long memory." "I have a longer one," Wallace said simply. Amos Fielding beamed at them both with the transparent delight of a man who was watching something happen and approved of it entirely. After supper that night, Anna asked him to walk with her to check on the garden. This was not an unusual request, as she often went out to the garden in the evening, but it was the first time she had specifically asked him to come with her. They walked along the kitchen garden in the late light, and she pointed out the different rows, the beans and the squash and the early potatoes, with the particular pleasure of someone showing you something they love. "My father taught me to garden," she said. "He believed that a person who could grow their own food was a person who could never be entirely helpless." "He sounds like a wise man," Wallace said. He was. She crouched down to pull a weed from between 2 rows of beans, and he crouched beside her without being asked, and they worked their way down the row together in the quiet way of people who are comfortable in each other's presence. "I miss him a great deal," she said, in the matter-of-fact tone she used to say things that were actually enormous. "But I am glad he left me this. The house, the garden, the life here, something real to hold on to." "Is that why you stayed?" he asked. After he died, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. The evening was golden and soft around them. "Partly," she said, "and partly because this is where I belong now. I have made it so." She paused. "I think that is something a person has to choose. Belonging somewhere, it does not simply happen to you." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it does not." She held his gaze for a beat that was slightly longer than the ordinary beat of a conversation. Then she stood up and brushed the soil from her hands with a small, contained smile. "The beans are coming in beautifully," she said. "We should have a good harvest in July." He stood up beside her. They were very close in the narrow garden row. He could see the small details of her face in the evening light, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting in the sun, the particular curve of her mouth when she was about to say something honest. He was aware with considerable clarity that the thing he had been arguing himself out of for weeks was no longer something he was successfully arguing himself out of. "Anna," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both registered it, a small shift in the air between them. She looked at him with those steady, seeing eyes. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said. "You usually are," she said, "when you choose to be." The quiet sting in that was fair, and he acknowledged it. "I came here to be done with the person I was," he said. "I had not planned on anything beyond that. I had not thought past the going somewhere and stopping." He paused, searching for the right words. "But I find myself thinking past it now, and I do not want to deceive you about my intentions." She was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then she said, "What exactly are your intentions, Mr. Malone?" He held her gaze. "To court you," he said, "if you will allow it, honestly and without rushing anything. But I did not think it was right to keep standing in your kitchen and sitting at your table and walking in your garden without telling you that is what I would like." She looked at him for a long moment, and in that look he could see her turning it over with the same careful consideration she brought to everything, not reacting impulsively but actually thinking. "You are a man with a complicated past," she said. "You have said so yourself." "Yes. And you are working honestly now. You have been here nearly 2 months, and you have done nothing that has given me cause for concern, and a great deal that has given me cause for the opposite." "That is my intention to continue," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "And you are asking my permission to court me, not telling me that you will." "Yes," he said. "Because you are not a woman who responds well to being told things." At that she did smile fully and genuinely, and it was a beautiful thing to see. "No," she agreed, "I am not." She looked at him for another quiet moment. "Then yes, Mr. Malone, you may court me, honestly and without rushing. Those are terms I can agree to." He felt something in his chest ease open, like the same door he had been imagining, moving all the way through. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Wallace," she said, trying his given name in return, and it sounded different in her voice than it had ever sounded anywhere, like it belonged to a better version of himself. "Come and see what I am doing with the squash." He followed her further into the garden, smiling at nothing in particular. Courting Anna Carter was not a dramatic or theatrical enterprise. It was not the kind of courtship he had observed in the more civilized East, with calling cards and parlor visits and elaborate performances. It was the kind of courtship that matched her character, practical and honest, and punctuated by genuine moments of warmth that meant more for their rarity. He brought her a copy of a book she had mentioned wanting, A Natural History of North American Prairie Plants, which he had ordered from the bookseller in Wichita through the settlement's mail arrangements, and which arrived 3 weeks later in a brown paper parcel that he left on the kitchen table for her, with a small note in his careful, slightly angular handwriting that said simply, "You mentioned this." She had stood at the kitchen counter and opened the parcel and looked at the book, and then looked at him sitting at the table with his morning coffee, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Thank you, Wallace," in the quiet voice she used for things that genuinely moved her. He took her riding on a Sunday in late May, both of them on horses borrowed from Hale's stable, out onto the open prairie east of the settlement where the grass was coming in green, and the sky was enormous above them, and you could hear the whole silence of the land. She rode well, with the easy confidence of someone who had learned young, and they rode side by side for a long while without talking, which was one of the things he liked best about her. The way she understood that silence between two people who are comfortable with each other is not empty but full. They stopped at a rise where you could see the settlement below, small and definite against the vast spread of the prairie, and she looked at it with the expression of someone looking at something they love. It is not much, she said. I know that compared to a city or even a proper town. It is a great deal, he said, compared to nothing. She looked at him. Is that what you had before? Nothing. He thought about it honestly. Motion, he said, which is a kind of nothing sustained over a long time. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. My father used to say that a person needs roots and wings both, she said. That without roots you drift and without wings you suffocate. I think he was right. She paused. I have been all roots since he died. I have been afraid to want anything beyond what I already have. He looked at her profile against the sky. And now, she turned to look at him. And now I am a little less afraid, she said, with the particular courage of someone who does not say such things easily. I think you have something to do with that. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand carefully, and she let him hold it, and they sat there on the rise above Caldwell Creek with their hands joined and the prairie wind moving through the grass below them, and it was one of the finest things he had ever experienced. In early June, Wallace made a decision. He rode to see Theodore Hale on a Tuesday morning, which was his own time, and he had a long conversation with Hale about the future. He had enough saved now from nearly 3 months of wages to put a deposit on a small parcel of land that had come available a half-mile south of the settlement, a piece that had been unsuccessfully homesteaded by a family who had given up the previous fall and returned east. The land was rough but workable. There was a small structure on it that could be repaired and expanded into something livable. Hale listened to him and then said, "You are planning to stay then?" "Yes," Wallace said. Hale looked at him with a slow, considering expression. "This would not have anything to do with Anna Carter's boarding house being the place you have been living," he said. Wallace did not look away. "It has something to do with it," he said, "among other reasons." Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She is a good woman, one of the best people in this settlement, and I do not say that lightly. She held this town together after her father died, and she has never once asked anyone for anything she did not need." He paused. "I am not telling you this to warn you off. I am telling you because a man ought to know the quality of the thing he is considering." "I know it," Wallace said quietly. "All right then," Hale said. "Come to me if you need a character reference for the land office." Wallace bought the parcel. He paid the deposit from his savings and arranged a modest mortgage for the remainder, which he could service from his ongoing wages. He did not tell Anna until he had the documents in hand, and then he told her plainly, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while Amos Fielding was reading in the parlor. "I bought the Hendricks parcel," he said. She looked up from the ledger she had been working on. "The one south of the road?" "Yes." She set down her pen. "You are staying," she said. Not a question, but the statement of someone who is deciding what they feel about something. "I am staying," he confirmed. "I want you to know that this decision was made for its own reasons, not to put any pressure on you. I'm not trying to corner you into anything." He met her eyes steadily. "But I also wanted to be honest, as I have been trying to be. I am building something here, and I would like very much for you to be part of it, when and if that is something you want." Anna put her hands flat on the table and looked at him with the full weight of her attention, which was considerable. He could see the complexity of what she was thinking moving behind her eyes, the same careful turning of things that he had come to recognize as her process. "You have been honest with me from the beginning," she said. "More honest than most people are willing to be." She paused. "My father's dead on the land office parcel. Do you know about it?" He was quiet for a moment, then said honestly, "Martha Cullen mentioned it." She nodded, unsurprised. "I will pay it myself. I want you to know that. I am not looking for someone to solve my problems." "I know that," he said. "I would not dream of trying." The small smile again. "Good." She looked at him steadily. "I care for you, Wallace. More than I had expected to. More than I think is entirely sensible given that you have been here less than 3 months. But I have never been dishonest with myself about what I feel, and I am not going to start." She straightened slightly. "I would like to see where this goes, properly and in the right time." He felt the warmth of it move through him like good whiskey, but better. "I would like that too," he said. She picked up her pen. "Then let us see. and there was something in the lightness of her voice, something approaching happiness, that made the small kitchen feel like the best place he had ever sat. He spent his free hours through June working on the parcel. It was hard, absorbing work, the kind that demanded every part of him and left no room for the old ghosts to crowd in. He cleared brush and repaired the structure's roof, and relaid the floor boards and built a proper fence around the yard. He worked with the focused determination of a man who is building towards something he can see clearly now, the shape of a future that 6 months ago he would not have allowed himself to imagine. Anna came out to the parcel on a Saturday in late June, riding Jasper, who had taken to her in the easy way that good horses take to people who know how to be calm around them. She walked through the partially repaired structure and stood in the doorway and looked at the cleared yard and the new fence and the prairie beyond, and she said, "You have done a great deal with it." "It will need more," he said, "but it is solid." She turned to look at him in the doorway, and the light was behind her and around her, and he thought with sudden, total clarity that he was going to ask her to marry him, not today, not yet, but as soon as it was the right time, and that the asking was going to be the most important and the most terrifying thing he had ever done in a life that had contained some genuinely terrifying moments. July arrived with the Kansas heat in full force, dry and enormous, pressing down on the settlement from a sky that was a white and remorseless blue for days at a time. Anna's garden produced abundantly in the heat, and the kitchen of the boarding house smelled perpetually of preserving and fresh beans, and the sweet, heavy smell of tomatoes ripening on every windowsill. Wallace finished the work on the parcel, and it was, in a modest but genuine way, a home. He continued to board at Anna's house because the time had not yet come for the other thing, and because he was not ready to leave the boarding house kitchen table and the yellow lamplight and the comfortable evenings with Anna and Amos Fielding, and because Anna had made no move to suggest he should leave, which he read as a positive sign. On a warm evening in the middle of July, after supper, Anna took him to the garden as she often did, and they sat on the bench he had built for her against the south wall of the house, where the warmth of the sun stored itself in the wood and kept the chill of the evening at bay. She had brought out her book of prairie plants and was showing him something about the wild ones she had identified on their rides, and he was listening to her with the pleasure he always took in hearing her talk about things she was interested in, the way her voice took on an extra quality of life and precision. She reached the point where she was describing a particular species of flowering grass, and she stopped and looked at him and said, "You are not listening to the book." "I am listening to you," he said. "Those are different things." She held his gaze. The evening was very quiet around them, the last birds settling, the soft sounds of the settlement at rest. He was aware of the precise distance between them on the bench, a foot of space that was not so much physical distance as the last remaining polite formality of something that had been honest and building between them for months now. He moved that distance. He turned toward her and took her hand in both of his and said, quietly and directly, the way he had learned to say things because she respected directness, "Anna, I love you. I have been arriving at that conclusion since the first evening I sat at your table, and I am done arriving. I love you completely, and I know I am asking you to trust a man whose history is not simple, and I know I cannot undo anything that came before, but I can tell you what I am building, and I can ask you to be part of it." She looked at him for a long, full moment in which he could see everything she was thinking, the caution and the hope and the weighing of it. Then she put her free hand against his jaw, which was unexpected and tender and very much her, and she said, "I love you too, Wallace. I have been standing in my own way about saying it, but I am tired of standing in my own way." He kissed her, there in the garden in the warm July evening, with the smell of tomatoes and basil around them and the last light fading out of the western sky. It was a gentle and honest kiss, the kind between two people who have been moving toward each other slowly and carefully, and are finally, actually here, and it said everything that the months before it had been building toward. When they separated, she was still holding his face in her hand, and she was smiling the way he had learned was the real smile, the one she did not produce for social occasions, but only when something had actually reached her. "Well," she said softly. "Well," he agreed. She laughed, a small, genuine, delighted sound that he had not heard from her before and that he immediately decided was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. "I have been running a boarding house and managing a debt and tending a garden and trying not to fall in love with my own tenant," she said. "And here we are. Here we are," he said. She took her hand back and straightened her spine with a composure that was so perfectly characteristic that he loved her even more for it. "I suppose we should discuss this sensibly," she said. "I suppose we should," he agreed, though he was still holding her hand. "You have a parcel," she said. "It needs work still." "A good amount, yes. The house here is mine. The debt has 2 more quarterly payments, after which it is clear." She looked at him steadily. "I am not going to rush anything," she said. "But I am not going to stand in my own way either." He looked at her. "Anna Carter," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. Not today. Not until I have something more to offer you than a half-repaired parcel and a summer's worth of wages. But I want you to know that is what I am working toward, and I want you to tell me now if that is not something you want so I know where things stand." She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "It is something I want, very much, so you had better keep working toward it." He pressed his lips to the back of her hand. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She pulled her hand back with great dignity and stood up. "Come inside," she said. "I am going to make coffee." He followed her into the kitchen, feeling lighter than he had in a very long time. He worked through August with a goal now, a specific and real one, and the work took on a different quality because of it. He finished the repairs on the parcel and began adding a second room to the structure, working evenings and all day Saturday with Cooper from Hale's Ranch, who turned out to be a skilled carpenter, in addition to a skilled roper, and who assisted with the framing in exchange for help at the ranch during the late summer branding. He also had a conversation he had been putting off. He went to the county seat in mid-August and spent a full day at the records office looking into the old complaints and warrants that might still be attached to his name. He did this with the help of a lawyer in the county seat, a lean, careful man named Abernathy who had an office above the hardware store and who handled land disputes and similar matters for the settlements in the district. Abernathy had the measured expression of a man who had heard a great many things and been surprised by very few of them. There were no active warrants in his name in Kansas or in the territories he knew of. The land baron in Colorado had moved on to other things. The work he had done in his former life had been, largely, conducted through intermediaries and oral arrangements with no written record attaching him to specific events. This did not make him innocent of anything, but it meant that the legal past at least was genuinely past. He returned to Caldwell Creek feeling cleaner than he had in years. He told Anna about it. He sat at the kitchen table on the evening he returned and told her he had gone to check and what he had found, and she listened to all of it without interrupting and then said, "I am glad you did that. I needed to know," he said, "before anything else moves forward. I needed to know that nothing was going to come back." She looked at him with the honest, clear eyes he had come to rely on as a kind of compass. "The only thing that matters to me about your past," she said carefully, "is that you have left it. Not that it was clean, because I understand that it was not, and I am not asking you to be someone you were not, but that you have genuinely left it." "I have," he said. "Then I believe you," she said, simply, without qualification, and that simplicity was worth more than any elaborate reassurance. September came in with a cooler edge and the particular quality of light that the Kansas autumn produced, golden and low and deeply beautiful. The parcel was nearly ready. He had added the second room, replastered the interior walls, hung new doors, built proper shelves in the kitchen area and a good strong table. It was not grand, but it was solid, and it was his, made from honest work, and when he stood in the doorway and looked at it, he felt for the first time in his adult life the uncomplicated satisfaction of having built something real. He went to Martha Cullen's store and spent an hour there making a specific purchase, which Martha facilitated with such enormous, barely suppressed delight that it was nearly comical. He took what he had bought and went to the boarding house on a Sunday morning when the settlement was quiet, and Amos Fielding was at church and Anna was in her kitchen garden with a cup of coffee, doing the end-of-season inspection of what needed to be cleared and what needed to be left for winter. He walked out to the garden and she turned and looked at him with her morning expression, open and unguarded in the way she was before the day had fully started, the way he loved most. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He crossed the garden to where she was standing and he took her hand and he looked at her in the clear September morning light and he said, "I told you I would wait until I had something more to offer. The parcel is ready. The legal past is settled. I have saved enough to clear your father's debt to the land office, if you will let me do that as the first thing we do together rather than as something I do for you without asking." He watched her expression and saw her understand the distinction and accept it. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the ring, which was a simple gold band with a small red stone that Martha Cullen had helped him choose from the selection the general store maintained for this exact kind of occasion. "Anna Carter, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and then at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that he had learned meant she was feeling something she was managing carefully. She was quiet for a moment, just long enough to be herself about it and not impulsive. "Yes," she said, "Wallace Malone, I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it there, and then she put both arms around him and held on, and he held her back, there in the autumn garden with the last of the season's vegetables around them and the Kansas sky enormous and blue above, and it was the most complete moment of his life. She said against his shoulder, "I have been refusing to let you walk away from this since May." He laughed low and warm. "I noticed. I was not going to let you waste it," she said. "What you are. What you could be here." He pulled back enough to look at her. "Is that what you were doing, refusing to let me waste it?" "Someone had to," she said, and there was the smile, the real one. "You were very committed to the idea of not deserving anything good." "I may have been wrong about that," he said. "You were entirely wrong about that," she said, "and you have known it for some time." He kissed her in the garden with the autumn light around them and the smell of turned earth and the distant sound of the church bell finishing its morning call, and it was warm and sure and right. They were married in the white church at the end of October, on a clear day with the sky the sharp, brilliant blue of the Kansas autumn, and a cold snap in the air that made the women's breath visible as they gathered outside. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who had arrived just that weekend and seemed genuinely pleased to have a wedding as well as his usual rounds. Anna wore her mother's dress, which she had kept carefully in a cedar chest, a deep cream color that suited her enormously. She walked down the aisle of the small church with Amos Fielding on her arm, because Fielding had become, in the absence of other family, something very close to a dear uncle, and his expression throughout the ceremony was one of unsustainable joy. Theodore Hale and his wife attended. Martha Cullen attended and wept in the frank, unashamed way of someone who considers herself responsible for the whole enterprise. Cooper from the ranch attended, in a clean shirt that appeared to cause him some discomfort, and stood beside Wallace and handed over the plain gold band at the correct moment with admirable precision. Wallace stood at the front of the church and watched Anna come toward him, and he thought about the man who had ridden into this settlement in April with nothing but regret and an old reputation and the genuine absence of any future worth imagining. And he thought about who he was standing here now, in this church, in this community, about to make a promise in front of everyone he had come to know and value in these months. The distance between those two men was the longest journey he had ever made, and the destination was standing in a cream-colored dress looking at him with those steady, seeing eyes. He made the promise with his whole heart. She made hers with a directness and an honesty that made several people in the church fight back what looked suspiciously like tears. After the ceremony, The settlement gathered in the open space between the church and the general store, which was by now a familiar location for Caldwell Creek's communal celebrations. Donovan played his fiddle with particular enthusiasm, apparently having assigned himself the role of the settlement's chief musical commentator on Wallace and Anna's relationship. The dancing was considerably better than it had been at the April festival, at least on Wallace's part, perhaps because this time he had considerably more reason to be present. He danced with his wife on the grass of Caldwell Creek in the October afternoon, and she danced with him, and they were good together in the particular way of two people who have been learning each other for months and have arrived at a fluency. They moved onto the parcel the following week. Anna's boarding house they let to a pair of sisters who had arrived in the settlement looking for work and who wanted to continue the boarding enterprise, which suited Anna. She kept the property because it was hers, and she was not a woman who let go of things she had built, but she hired the sisters to run the day-to-day of it and kept the oversight herself. The debt to the land office had been settled the week before the wedding, paid together as they had agreed, and the relief of it was visible in Anna, a small but real lightening that Wallace was glad to have been part of. Life on the parcel was harder than the boarding house in some ways and better in all the ways that mattered. There was always work, always something that needed doing, but it was their work and their land and their life, made by their own hands and their own choices. Anna brought her kitchen garden and her natural history books and her organized, practical intelligence, and she applied them to the new property with the same focused attention she had applied to everything she had ever cared about. Wallace built things and fixed things and worked at Hale's ranch in the busy seasons, and cultivated a small number of cattle of his own on the land, which he expanded slowly and carefully, because he was a man who had learned the value of not overreaching. November brought the first real cold, and they spent evenings by the fire that Wallace had rebuilt in the stone hearth, the previous one having been structurally unsound when he arrived. Anna read and he sat across from her and read or simply sat, and this, which might have seemed to someone else to be nothing, was to him everything he had ever not known how to want. She talked about her father in the evening sometimes, telling stories about his carpentry and his sense of humor and the particular way he had of looking at things that she had inherited, and Wallace listened with the attention he gave to things that mattered. He told her, slowly and in pieces across those evenings, more of his history, not all of it, not the parts that served no purpose to say, but the true shape of it, the path from a difficult boyhood in a rough part of Missouri through the years of hired work, the gradual accumulation of things done that could not be undone, and finally the Colorado morning when he had looked at a family in a doorway and turned his horse around. She listened with the same steady, unsurprised attention she gave to everything. She never flinched and she never excused and she never looked at him differently. She said once, "You are not that person anymore." Not to comfort him, but as a statement of observable fact. "I am trying very hard to be sure of that," he said. "I see it every day," she said. "That is enough." He believed her, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. By the time the first snowfall came to Caldwell Creek in late November, covering the settlement and the prairie in a silence that was total and clean and bright, Anna was fairly certain, and by December she was entirely certain, and she told Wallace on a cold, clear evening sitting by the fire. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, directly and without performance. "We are going to have a baby." He sat very still for a moment. He was aware of the fire crackling and the snow pressing against the windows and the whole vast quiet of the winter prairie, and inside this specific, enormous, unimaginable fact, he looked at his wife. "Anna," he said, and could not immediately say anything else. She watched him with her warm, steady eyes, a small smile at the corner of her mouth, waiting for him to arrive. "Are you well?" he managed. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Strong as an ox, as Martha Cullen would say." He stood up and went to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her and took her hands and looked at her. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands for a moment, and he was aware of something moving through him that he could not name precisely, something between gratitude and wonder and a love so large it had no bottom he could find. He looked up at her. "I did not know," he said quietly, "that it was possible to have this much." She brought one hand free and put it gently to his face. "You were rather determined to believe otherwise," she said, "but here you are." "Here I am," he said. She smiled. He kissed her hands. The fire burned warm behind him and the snow fell in Caldwell Creek, and the whole world outside was quiet and vast and clean. The winter passed. Anna was indeed strong through her pregnancy, as she had said, managing the oversight of the boarding house and the household of the parcel, and the kitchen garden planning for spring with the same organized energy that characterized everything she did. Wallace was quietly, comprehensively attentive in a way that she occasionally found excessive and told him so, which did not particularly reduce the attentiveness. He talked to Theodore Hale that winter about expanding his own small cattle operation, and Hale, who had developed a genuine fondness for Wallace and a respect for his work ethic, offered to sell him 10 head at a fair price to add to the 5 he already had. Wallace accepted. He could see the shape of the thing he was building, modest but real, growing a little more defined each season. Amos Fielding came to dinner every Sunday. He had remained at the boarding house with the new proprietors, the 2 sisters named Ruth and Clara Voss, who were capable and good-natured and had adapted quickly to the work. Amos treated the Sunday dinners at Wallace and Anna's table as his primary social engagement of the week, and he brought the news of the settlement and stories about his students and occasional readings from whatever book he was currently working through. And the 3 of them around the table on Sunday evenings felt like the particular kind of family that is assembled from choice rather than blood, and is no less real for that. The spring of 1879 came to Caldwell Creek, and with it the full green explosion of the prairie emerging from winter. And in March, on a morning that was cold but bright, Anna gave birth to their son. He was born in the bedroom of the parcel house with the help of the settlement's doctor, a quiet, capable man named Dr. Samuel Prout, who had been in Caldwell Creek since before Anna's father arrived, and Martha Cullen, who had appointed herself indispensable to the occasion, and was entirely right to do so. Wallace stayed as near as he was permitted, and found the hours of waiting to be among the most difficult of his life, not because he feared danger, though he did, but because the waiting held the weight of everything that might be and everything that was at stake. When Dr. Prout came to the door and said it was done and they were both healthy, Wallace put his hand on the doorframe and breathed. He went in to his wife, who was exhausted and radiant in the way of women who have just accomplished something tremendous, and she held up the small wrapped bundle in her arms and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms and he held him, this small, fierce, new person, and he looked at his face, pink and perfect and ancient with the particular gravity of newborns. And then he looked at Anna and there were no words for what he felt. He did not try to find any. She seemed to know anyway from his face, and she put her head back against the pillow and smiled the real smile. They named him John for her father. John Wallace Malone was, from the beginning, a person of considerable opinions and healthy lungs, and the parcel house in the winter evenings was no longer quiet in the way it had been, but it was warm and alive in a way that was better. Wallace learned the particular capabilities of a man responsible for an infant, the feeding and the settling and the walking at all hours, and he did them without complaint, and with a wonder that never entirely left him, that this small, insistent person existed and was his. Anna watched her husband with their son with the quiet attentiveness she brought to everything she loved, and she saw in those months the final and complete version of what she had been seeing since the beginning, the man he had been working to become. The last of the old hardness gone, not replaced by softness, but by something better than either, a genuine settledness, a man at peace with where he was and who he was becoming. She told him this one evening in April 1879, a year and a month after his arrival in Caldwell Creek, when they were sitting on the repaired porch of their house with John asleep inside, and the spring evening coming in warm around them. She said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. "The day you walked into the general store," she said, "I saw something in you. I'm not sure what it was exactly. Not anything romantic, not then, just something real, like a man who had been carrying everything wrong and was ready to put it down." He looked at her in the evening light. "You were frightening," he said, "the way you looked at me." "I know," she said, unrepentant. "I have been told that." "It was good," he said. "It was exactly what I needed. Someone to look at me like they could see through the whole thing." She reached across and took his hand. "I have never seen you as anything other than who you actually are," she said. "And who you actually are is a very good man." He held her hand and looked at the spring prairie and the last light in the western sky and thought about the man who had ridden into this settlement with nothing and no future and a name that used to mean something dangerous. That man had come here to bury his past. He had not counted on Anna Carter, who looked at people with clear eyes and refused to let them settle for the worst version of themselves. "I came here to disappear," he said. "I know," she said. "I would not let you." "No," he agreed. "You would not." He squeezed her hand and she leaned against him on the porch, and they sat together while the evening came fully in. And inside the house, their son slept the deep sleep of the very young, and the settlement of Caldwell Creek settled into its quiet evening sounds around them. The summer of 1879 was a good one by the standards of the Kansas frontier. The rains came at the right intervals, and the cattle grew fat on good grass, and the kitchen garden at the parcel house was so productive that Anna began supplying the brass lantern with produce and trading surplus to Martha Cullen's store for credit. The small herd was growing. The parcel was improving each season. The boarding house under Ruth and Clara Voss continued to generate a modest income that Anna managed with her characteristic precision. Amos Fielding made an announcement at one of the Sunday dinners that he had been offered the position of district school administrator, which would require him to move to the county seat. He was both pleased and sorrowful about it, and the dinner that evening had the particular quality of a celebration that is also a small grief. They drank to his new position with the good wine that Hale had given them as a wedding gift and had been saving for an appropriate occasion, and Amos Fielding cried openly without the slightest embarrassment, which was very much in his character. "You are the best of everything this settlement has," he said, looking at Wallace and Anna with John on Wallace's knee gnawing industriously on a carved wooden horse that Fielding had made himself. "I want you to know that. I have watched what you have built here, both of you. And it is the finest thing." Anna reached across and put her hand over Fielding's. "We will come to visit," she said. "And you will come back for the Harvest Festival and for Christmas." He came back for both, and every year after that, and the Sunday table was kept for him when he returned. He brought books for John as the boy grew, and later for John's younger sister, born in the summer of 1881 and named Eleanor, and later still for the third Malone child, a second son named Thomas, who arrived in 1883 and was from his earliest days the most determined of the three. The years passed in the way that good years pass, not without difficulty, because the frontier was not a place that permitted permanent ease, not without loss, not without the ordinary griefs of weather and sickness and the hard work of living, but with a sustained and deepening richness that Wallace had not previously understood was available to him. He became a man the settlement trusted. This was not a thing he had planned or pursued deliberately, but it happened organically in the way that trust builds when a person is consistently, reliably who they say they are. When disputes came up about land boundaries or water rights, people talked to Wallace. When Theodore Hale decided to retire from active ranching in 1882 and wanted to sell to someone who would keep the land well, he sold the majority of it to Wallace at a fair price, and the expanded Malone Ranch became one of the more stable operations in the area. He never entirely lost the awareness of who he had been. He did not think that was appropriate. He carried it the way a man carries a scar, not painfully, but as a part of his physical self that he could not and would not deny. It made him careful and humble in the way of someone who knows what he is capable of at his worst and takes that knowledge seriously. Anna watched all of this with her characteristic clear-eyed attention and loved him for exactly what he was, the whole of it, the complicated history and the daily honest present. She grew more beautiful to him as the years went on, in the way that familiarity that is also love produces a beauty that increases rather than diminishes with time. She was still the most direct person he had ever encountered. She still assessed strangers with an expression that gave them slightly too much information about whether they were making a good impression. She still took care of every person in her orbit with the particular brand of unsentimental practical love that was entirely characteristic of her. He told her, on their 5th anniversary in October 1883, what he had never quite managed to say fully in words. They were sitting on the porch in the autumn evening with the sounds of the 3 children asleep inside and the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into night, and he took her hand and said, "I want to tell you something that I think about regularly and have not adequately said." She turned to look at him with her attention fully present in the way it always was with him. "When I rode into Caldwell Creek," he said, "I had decided that the best I could hope for was to stop. Just stop moving and stop doing harm and try to live the rest of my life at a kind of zero, not good enough for anything worth having, not bad enough to be actively dealt with. That was my plan." He looked at her. "And then I walked into your store and you looked at me like you could see every inch of the truth and you did not look away from it, and that was the beginning of something I had not included in the plan." She was quiet, watching him. "You refused," he said. "You refused to let me settle for the nothing I had decided I deserved. Not loudly, not dramatically, just by being who you are, by seeing me and not looking away, by building something real and expecting me to be capable of building alongside it." He brought her hand to his lips. "You gave me everything, Anna. You gave me this life, and I want you to know that I know it and I do not take a single day of it for granted." She looked at him for a long moment in the October evening and her eyes were bright. "You built it yourself," she said, with the precision she always brought to the truth. "Every fence post and every hour and every honest word. I did not do that for you. You believed it was possible," he said, "when I did not." She looked at him steadily and then she said quietly, "I believe in you, Wallace Malone. I believed in you the first week you were here and I have never stopped." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the way she had been leaning into him for 5 years, and they sat on the porch of the home they had built from work and honesty, and a love that had grown up slowly and steadily from the particular Kansas ground of Caldwell Creek. Inside the house, John stirred briefly in his sleep and settled. Eleanor was silent in the deep, undisturbed sleep of small children. Thomas made one of the small sounds he made when he was dreaming about something energetic, which was most things. The October sky above the Kansas prairie was enormous and clear and brilliant with stars, the way it was out here where there was nothing to interrupt the dark, and the air carried the clean, cold smell of autumn and turned earth and the particular fragrance of a place that had been tended with care. "I should go in and check on Thomas," Anna said after a while. "He rolled off the edge of the bed yesterday and did not tell me until supper time." Wallace laughed softly. "He is your son." "He is very much your son," she said. "All that determination to do things without asking for help." He laughed again, warmer, and she stood and went inside and he stayed for a moment on the porch, looking out at the night over the land that was his, built from nothing into something real, and he felt, as he felt every evening of this life, the deep, settled, uncomplicated rightness of being exactly where he was. He went inside to his family. The years that followed were years of growth and constancy in equal measure. The Malone Ranch expanded modestly and continued to be a stable part of the Caldwell Creek community's agricultural landscape. John grew into a quiet, curious boy with his mother's direct gaze and his father's thoughtful manner, and showed an early aptitude for the mechanical that resulted in the entire farm equipment being in significantly better repair than most ranches of comparable size. Eleanor was fierce and organized, and had her mother's relationship with the garden and a gift for the natural world that Amos Fielding, on his annual visits, encouraged with books and conversation, and the particular attention of a man who recognizes a fine mind. Thomas was indeed the most determined of the three, the child who attempted everything without preliminary caution, and made up in resilience what he occasionally lost in forethought. And he was also the most purely warm-hearted, a child who cried freely and loved loudly, and filled every room he entered with a kind of undiluted aliveness. Martha Cullen remained the general store's proprietor and the settlement's primary information network until her son came back from a stint in the East and took over the store, at which point she retired to the house next door and continued performing both functions from her front porch with remarkable efficiency. Theodore Hale visited the ranch in its new expanded form with visible pleasure and died peacefully in his sleep in 1886, which Wallace learned had been his preference, stated on multiple occasions. They attended his funeral with the whole settlement, and Wallace stayed after to help carry the coffin, which was the kind of thing he did without being asked, because it was the kind of thing that needed doing. The settlement grew. Not dramatically, not in the explosive way of the boom towns further along the railroad lines, but steadily, with families arriving each year and taking up land and learning the particular rhythms of that piece of Kansas. A new church was built in 1884, larger and better painted than the old one. A proper doctor's office replaced the converted storeroom that Dr. Prout had used. A hotel went up alongside the boarding house, and Ruth and Clara Voss adapted admirably to the competition by specializing in long-term boarders and maintaining the character of their establishment. Wallace and Anna watched all of this from the vantage point of people who had been there long enough to remember the before and understand the after. They were, without having sought it, a kind of anchor in the community, the visible proof that staying was worth something, that building honestly paid out over time. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary in October 1888, they were sitting at the long table in the farmhouse kitchen with all three children and Amos Fielding, who had made the trip from the county seat with considerable deliberate ceremony. Ruth Voss had come, and Martha Cullen, who at this point was something between a neighbor and a fixed institution. Theodore Hale's widow was there. Cooper from the old ranch, who had long since taken up his own land nearby, was there with his wife, a formidably capable woman named Grace who had arrived in the settlement in 1882, and whom Cooper had married with the same economy of expression he applied to everything else in his life. Anna had cooked a meal that took 2 days to prepare, which she refused to characterize as an anniversary dinner and called simply a family gathering, though everyone at the table understood perfectly well what it was. After the meal, Amos Fielding stood up with his glass and said something about Wallace and Anna that was so precisely observed and so genuinely felt that there were tears on several faces around the table, including his own. He talked about watching two people who had both been carrying their histories carefully, one too much solitude and one too much motion, find each other and become more fully themselves in each other's company. He talked about the boarding house kitchen and the yellow lamp light and the particular quality of the evenings there. He talked about the garden and the first Caldwell Creek Festival and the way that love, when it is the real kind, announces itself not in dramatic gestures but in accumulated daily acts of choosing. He sat down to considerable noise from everyone at the table. Thomas, who was 5 and had been given a small glass of apple cider for the occasion, raised it with the seriousness of someone who understood this was a solemn moment, and said, "To Mama and Papa," which destroyed whatever composure remained in the room. Wallace stood, finally, because something needed to be said by him. He looked at the people at his table. He looked at Amos Fielding, who had been kind to him in the first weeks when kindness was the thing that made the difference. He looked at Martha Cullen, who had pointed him toward Anna's boarding house and had never once stopped being pleased about what resulted. He looked at his children, who were the living evidence of what 10 years of honest life produced. He looked at Anna, sitting at the other end of the table she had built this gathering around, looking at him with the same warm, steady, seeing eyes that had looked at him across the general store counter in April of 1878 and started all of this. "I came to Caldwell Creek to bury my past," he said. "I did not plan to find anything. I was not looking for anything. I had decided I was not entitled to it." He paused. "I was wrong. And the reason I was wrong is sitting at the other end of this table, who refused from the very beginning to let me believe otherwise." He raised his glass. "Anna Carter Malone, you are every good thing that has happened to me. Thank you for not letting me walk away from this." She looked at him across the table, and the real smile moved across her face, full and bright, the one that was only for moments when something had genuinely reached her. "You stayed," she said simply. "That was all you." He held her gaze and thought about how that was both true and not the whole truth, and that the part that was not the whole truth was sitting right there in that smile. The stubborn, clear-eyed refusal of Anna Carter to let a man believe he was worth less than he was. They drank the toast. The kitchen was warm and the voices were all of them familiar and beloved, and outside the Kansas night was clear and cold and enormous, and inside the house on the land that Wallace Malone had built from nothing, life was full in every direction, and there was no end to it that either of them could see. John cleared the dishes with the practical helpfulness that was entirely his character. Eleanor argued with Thomas over something minor and was talked back down by Amos Fielding with practiced ease. Martha Cullen told a story about the early days of the settlement that nobody present had heard in its current particular version, which meant she had improved it. Wallace found his way to Anna's side as the evening settled into its quieter latter hours, and she leaned against him the way she had been leaning against him for a decade, perfectly comfortable and fully present, and he put his arm around her. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. She turned her face up to look at him. "Are you happy, Wallace?" He looked at her, at the face he knew better than any other thing on earth, at the brown eyes and the dark hair now threaded with the first fine silver, at the honesty she wore in every line of her expression. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said. "I am the happiest I know how to be, and I expect to be happier still." She smiled. "Good," she said. "So do I." He kissed her in their kitchen with the people they loved around them, and it was quiet and right and entirely real. Outside, Caldwell Creek held its familiar evening shape, the church and the general store and the brass lantern and the boarding house at the end of the street. The prairie lay out around it in every direction, vast and patient and endlessly present, the way the land is in Kansas, not dramatic but permanent, not asking anything, just there. The stars came out above it, the same stars that had been there in April 1878, when a man with a worn saddlebag and a life full of the wrong kind of history had ridden down the main street of this small settlement looking for a place to disappear. He had not disappeared. He had arrived. He had arrived because a woman with clear eyes and a garden and a well-maintained boarding house, and a complete unwillingness to let a person settle for less than they were capable of had looked at him across a general store counter and seen something real, and had refused, in her quiet, direct, entirely characteristic way, to look away from it. And the rest was the life they had built, day by day and season by season, from honest work and honest love, on the Kansas ground, in the small and permanent settlement of Caldwell Creek.